Thank you. I'll get into the legal aspects of the agreement now. And just a little bit of background on where we were when we started the review, the debate, the negotiations over it. Next slide, please. It was developed as a universal agreement to avoid renegotiating and reviewing the terms and conditions for each new study. There were certain choices that were made, which was to make this an Ontario agreement focused on drug trials, and the parties to the agreement are the sponsor and institution. The term is intended to be a 5-year term, and there's an 60-day exit clause. So this is not the agreement itself contains a schedule, which is the form of a clinical trial specific agreement, and it's not an opportunity to renegotiate the universal agreement, but it is an opportunity to review, consider, and address specific issues based on specific clinical trials. An example is the name of the trial or the definition of the clinical trial drug. Next slide is with respect to drugs and equipment. I'm just going to highlight some of the issues that probably generated the most discussion and debate at the table in developing this agreement. I can't get through all of the agreement in 15 short minutes. But the definition of clinical trial drug is the drug and other products defined in the CTSA for the applicable protocol. So this is an opportunity for institution and sponsor to determine which drug is part of that definition, whether that definition includes the clinical trial drug in addition to any control, placebo, or standard of care medication. The impact on this with respect to negotiation is how you address your reps and warranties. So sponsors might give certain reps and warranties on their own drug, for example, that it was manufactured in accordance with GMP, but they might be reluctant to give the same rep and warranty on any other's drugs if they're used as comparators or controls. What's new in the agreement is the drug labeling requirements are explicitly spelled out, and they reflect Health Canada's requirements under the Food and Drugs Act. And the sponsors wanted more specificity in terms of the required accountability logs to verify adherence to the SOPs and to ensure that the clinical trial drug is used only for clinical trial purposes. In terms of equipment, the agreement is clear that the sponsor remains responsible for any equipment that's borrowed by institution and for its maintenance, repair, and insurance. Next slide. Biological materials. The issues on biological materials are addressed discreetly in a standalone article. And the way in which it's addressed, it leaves the door open for biobanking by sponsors, because in the past, these agreements have said that biological materials can only be used with respect to specific clinical trials under the protocol. What it now leaves the door open for is that if the REB approves in its informed consent other applications for the biological materials, and if the individual clinical trial participant signs the form, then there could potentially be other uses of biological materials. The agreement says that any leftover materials are to be returned to the sponsor or destroyed, and it's clear that neither the institution nor the PI has any authority to grant ownership of biological materials to the sponsor. There is a provision in there that says that if institution or PI use the biological materials in contravention of the agreement, meaning if they use it for purposes other than the trial, then the sponsor obtains any IP associated with that use. That's a bit of a guardrail for the sponsor to ensure that the biological materials are used only for the trial, as the sponsor paid for the acquisition of those materials. Next slide. In terms of privacy and personal information protection, the approach taken is similar as that approach taken for biological materials. Generally speaking, the theory is the sponsor does not get personal health information, but there's no way to fully guarantee that there has been full de-identification. So there's still some safeguards in the agreement protecting that PHI in accordance with applicable law. The theory is that the auditor or monitor of the sponsor views the PHI but does not copy or remove it from the site. And so sponsors' obligations are clear in terms of how they protect the PHI. It's in accordance with the REB approved consent form, and it's in accordance with applicable law. And the language of this actually relates to the agency of the study subject as opposed to the institution's custody and control. So again, there's an opportunity for the study subject to be able to consent to more uses of their personal health information other than with respect to that specific clinical trial under that protocol. Next slide. Access to premises rules. This is a provision that generated a lot of discussion, and I think that there were compromises made by both sides and a good solution was reached. Generally, sponsor gets access to the site's premises for two reasons. One is in order to install, inspect, or remove their equipment for the study, and the other is with respect to their own auditing or monitoring or their attendance at a regulatory authority's inspection. And so the compromise situation is the institution has to have reasonable policies and procedures in place that they communicate to the sponsor in writing before attendance at the site. These are not policies that have to be determined in advance of signing the agreement, but they have to be determined in writing in advance of attendance at the site. And the policies would generally cover things like equipment receipt and maintenance, privacy, security, confidentiality, health and safety requirements. What's new in this agreement is that confidentiality rules are mutual. There's a little bit of expansion in terms of the wording, and there are safeguards and breach notification provisions that go both ways, institution to sponsor and sponsor to institution. There's also a new irreparable harm clause in the agreement. Next slide is with respect to safety reporting. So the way this was addressed is adverse event is defined in the agreement as what it means as defined in the protocol. So this means it could be a little bit broader than the definition of ICH GCP because some sponsors need to collect more information, more reporting. And so if there is no definition in the protocol, then the default is that it is as defined in ICH GCP. Sponsors also asked for the IP to provide prompt notice of events that could lead to any recall, withdrawal, or retrieval of the clinical trial drug, should those events come to the PI's attention, and also for PI to report any manufacturing, packaging, labeling, dosage, or formulation complaints that they receive from sub or co-investigators or from participants themselves. The timing of the reporting would be spelled out in the CTSA or the protocol as different sponsors have different requirements. Next slide. Financial provisions are expanded. They are more clear in terms of sponsor obtaining the SHRED credit. There's more explicit provisions on tax provisions, no rebates for purchase of products, and there's anti-bribery, anti-corruption language. What each party needs to focus on really is the budget. There was a lot of discussion and debate in terms of who covers things like closeout fees and expenses. So sponsors' theory was this is captured in the overhead. Institutions' theory was this can't be absorbed as costs as it's a heavily regulated charitable entity. And so the compromise solution was that the budget would address this, what the closeout fees and expenses are. They would be pre-approved in advance. And the same applies for any reasonable expenses of institution of a sponsor audit or a regulatory authority inspection. So when you're reviewing your budgets, make sure you focus on those matters. And then there is no language in here in this agreement with respect to the institution or PI not conducting other trials with the same eligibility criteria. The theory being is that if a sponsor wants exclusivity, then they would need to pay for it as part of the budget. Next slide. Intellectual property really didn't change from the CCTC, MCTA. It's clear that sponsor obtains the intellectual property. They've paid for it. It's their trial. But there is a little bit more language with respect to institution inventions, which is not sponsor inventions. And there's clear language in terms of how institution gets a license from sponsor to use the sponsor IP, but only for internal and non-commercial purposes. And then finally, the provisions on limitation of liability, indemnification, clinical trial, participant injury. Next slide, please. There is a provision in there that talks about how neither party shall be responsible for indirect or consequential damages. However, there's a carve-out for sponsor where sponsor remains liable for any damages arising from their clinical trial drug and the warranties that they provide for it, from their use of personal health information, and from clinical trial participant injuries. There's clear language with respect to insurance levels and the coverage of it, as stated on this slide. And then there's an open door for other sponsor expenses with respect to clinical trial participant injuries, because the language says that in addition to the customary expenses a sponsor will cover, they can also cover any other clinical trial related injury that's described in the REB approved clinical trial informed consent form. So there's an opportunity to address that with respect to specific trials. And that is the end of my slides.